Welcome to From Policy to Practice, collaborating with curators for digital preservation selection. Next slide, please. I wanted to start by outlining our contributors today. I'm Lauren Work from the University of Virginia, Kelsey O'Connell from Northwestern University, Nathan Tallman from Penn State, Sora Dorpinghaus from the University of Kentucky, and Elena Colón-Marrero from the Computer History Museum, now at the Bentley Historical Library. Next slide, please. So, deciding what to preserve is often a stumbling block for organizations building or maintaining a digital preservation program. The question of how do we decide what to preserve over time needs careful consideration, strong collaboration, and a willingness to test and iterate on different selection methods and models. Though the practice of deciding what to preserve is core to library and archives work, the digitality of modern life creates new issues of scale and sustainability. In this panel, we will explore 4 different research universities and a museum, how they're implementing policies and practices to collaboratively select and appraise materials for digital preservation. Though our organizations have different missions and unique collections, and we are all at different digital preservation maturation stages, one through line that is shared amongst us is our successes and failures, and that's around the idea that collaboration is key. So a quick note that panelists are going to try to address questions in the chat as they appear. Next slide. We would like to acknowledge the land from which we are all working and learning today on this panel. This slide recognizes the ancestral homelands and traditional territories and peoples and our various current locations. Please feel free to share your information in the chat as well.
Hi, everyone. My presentation on joint appraisal processes at Northwestern University demonstrates the iterative steps of our appraisal work since Tallman and Work's 2018 Appraisal Selection Framework was published. Next slide. I started working at Northwestern in 2018 and inherited a board and digital archives workflow which contained no appraisal steps. This led to some challenges, including a dumping ground approach to our digital preservation storage. We had lots of data being preserved without knowing what it was or whether we would be keeping it permanently. Additionally, the lack of appraisal perpetuated a misconception that the digital records could only be managed by those with technical knowledge, which further decreased likelihood of collaboration. Next slide. Deriving our workflow from the selection appraisal framework provided us with the capability to unite concepts of technical and content appraisals. The imagery of a circle or infinity loop is appropriate to demonstrate how various considerations within each appraisal type informs the others. With digital records in particular, there isn't a simple one rule of appraisal that covers everything. Next slide. Before creating the prototype workflow, I identified our goals, which solidified the expectations that appraisal could improve our internal processes. Goals included improving our storage, determining appropriate preservation actions, making these decisions scalable, improving our collaborations, and getting a better handle on what we have overall. Next slide. A new appraisal workflow was first tested in early 2019. Major changes included, 1, documenting technical and content appraisal information about new materials prior to their arrival, therefore jumpstarting collaborative appraisal before materials are in the door. 2, conducting technical appraisals prior to ingesting the data into preservation storage permanently. And 3, the introduction of appraisal meetings to discuss, understand, and decide on next steps collaboratively. Next slide. This prototype guaranteed checkpoints throughout all of the major archival workflow phases to guarantee we assess both content and technical appraisal questions at different stages. The image demonstrates how appraisal choices can happen at nearly every phase of the archival workflow. Next slide. Because no 2 born digital collections are the same, these checkpoints were essential to introduce informed decision-making throughout our custody of the collection. We created a qualitative, conversation-based approach where I drafted questions to consider based on appraisal framework. Questioning appraisal throughout the accessioning and processing activities provided scalability. Less complex collections could be appraised quickly, complex collections could be appraised thoroughly, and anything else in between. It helped foster a shared understanding of why preservation actions are completed and necessary, as well as document our decisions and process more thoroughly. The choice for a qualitative approach rather than a quantitative survey or point system was based on our institutional needs and culture. It was more effective for us to create short meetings on other colleagues' calendars than requiring them to complete surveys or assessments. Next slide. As mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, this workflow required further iteration, not only to refine appraisal work, but also to secure the collaborative approach. The testing phase of initiating an appraisal workflow generated several key changes throughout 2020 to present. Knowing that a qualitative and conversational approach to joint appraisal jump-started far more collaboration across our colleagues, it was imperative to document and grow these conversational topics. This created 2 scripts as templates for questions to frame appraisal interviews across digital preservation practitioners, processing, accessioning, and curatorial staff. The content appraisal questionnaires included broad questions such as, what is the scope of the material, as well as more refined questions such as, is there a significant for duplicate files? The technical appraisal questionnaires similarly range from broad to refined questions, such as, what is the size of the data, or are there technological barriers for accessibility issues, such as needs for captioning or transcription? Asking both content and technical appraisal questions across a group of various staff members not only established the uniqueness and research value of a collection, but further clarified our feasibilities to manage the collection, as well as determine and justify necessary digital forensics, digital conservation, and/or digital preservation activities. The purpose of the questionnaires was not only not to complete an answer to every single question in both templates, but to encourage conversation around these topics if they needed to be covered. Further, it underscored the importance of how both content and technical appraisal questions inform one another. For example, certain contextual questions may not be answered or considered unless a technical appraisal question is answered, or vice versa. Next slide. While the conversational approach was most useful in creating collaboration, we did introduce some quantitative assessment measures in order to help prioritize collection management activities. We needed the appraisal workflow to help inform decisions of new accessions, current processing projects, and our unprocessed backlog. Within each of the 3 categories, we wanted to rank the collection as next in line for work utilizing the appraisal framework. For example, we receive accessions in chronological order, but that doesn't mean we have the feasibility to assess and ingest them in chronological order. Therefore, measuring an accession scope, uniqueness, and/or restrictions against its preservability, size, and our capabilities justifies prioritization for further accessioning, preservation, and processing work. The quantitative assessment is based on assigning broad points to the selection framework after conducting appraisal conversations and using those points to tier collections within each category. Next slide. The appraisal framework also informed updates to our digital preservation policy as it helps verify the levels of preservation assigned. At Northwestern, we assign collections into 1 of 3 levels to categorize which digital preservation actions are conducted. The decision to assign a level must be informed by appraisals, as preservation actions must be included or excluded based on a quality and content of a collection. Therefore, there is no single standardized ability to manage and preserve all digital assets equitably because of the many variabilities that comprise and affect data. Therefore, it is necessary to scale not only our appraisal decisions, but our digital preservation actions as well. The policy updates help our team reflect on and guide us toward a common goal. Ethically, we should not be applying efforts towards digital preservation activities on materials we have not appraised. As such, appraisal became a foundation for all the objectives of digital preservation practices, including scalability, access, authenticity, and integrity, collaboration and assessment, environmental sustainability, and rights, privacy, and security. Next slide. The final refinement completed to this process is to document the appraisals and compile those reports and quantitative rankings alongside digital content itself in preservation storage. In our preservation bag, or APE, the archival information package, we include a directory of various reports and information, one of which includes appraisal conversation reports and assessments. This allows us to retain technical decisions made about the collection, as well as serve as documentation for additional context and scope about the collection. An appraisal workflow iteration continues to this day. Our next endeavor, which has only recently begun, is to implement the assessment module in archive space to compile and report appraisals even more collaboratively. Next slide. I'm ending the presentation on a clincher of sorts to reflect again on the goals of implementing and sustaining appraisal activities in our workflow. We have indeed made progress on each of the goals. This demonstrates that a bit more checkpoints for appraisal work throughout various processes may sound like too much time and effort, but it improves collaboration and improves accessioning, preservation, and processing activities. Thank you, and next is Nathan.
Thanks, Kelsey. Hi, I'm Nathan, and I'm going to talk about collaborative selection and appraisal at Penn State. At Penn State, we use the Tallman Work 2018 framework that we've modified some of the criteria based on feedback during piloting. We have the new criterion of representation and agency, expanded cost into replacement cost and investment, and broke up preservability of content and context into their own criteria, provenance and authenticity, and preservability. These changes make the framework clear and more relevant to our collection stewards. We've implemented a weighted scoring model whose total score is used to recommend an appropriate level of digital preservation commitment as outlined in our digital preservation policy. Using this scoring model is optional. It's meant to be an aid in decision-making and help selectors and curators, but they're really free to use their expertise in other ways to decide on the appropriate level of digital preservation commitment. To help people assign point values, a rubric was developed that specifies the total points for each criteria and gives examples of possible point values. Initially, feedback was very helpful in fine-tuning the rubric to help keep the language useful to our selectors and curators. If we look at the research value criterion, the rubric gives options from a full 25 points with the content meeting content collection policy and has high research value, 20 points for medium research value, 15 points for low research value, and 0 points if it does not meet collection policy requirements or has no research value. The highest possible score is 100 points if there are no restrictions. Substantial access restrictions slightly decrease the preservation priority, but not enough to prevent preservation altogether. The point system was designed to make it hard to reach a level 3 or 75 or more points, the highest and most expensive level, basically requiring a legal or fiduciary obligation to the materials. For our system, 0 to 24 points recommends level 0 or no preservation, 25 to 49 points, level 1 or bit level, 50 to 74 points, level 2 or logical preservation, and 75 to 100 points for level 3 whole object preservation. The Penn State guidelines to select for digital preservation commitment give more information and richer descriptions than can be described in a rubric. For some, it may be easier to just read the guidelines, even if they don't use the scoring model. It also helps present explicit examples for both general and special collections. It is important to try and build connections between policies, guidelines, procedures, and other practices. This helps to keep policies relevant and prevent them from just getting dusty on a shelf or a virtual storage space. The more cohesive your program, the stronger it will be. These kinds of decisions are also iterative and should be revisited. Our guidelines currently recommend a 5-year review cycle, but this may need to be adjusted. If you create artifacts in your decision-making process, consider keeping those as inputs to future decision-making. So we have a framework, a rubric, and guidelines. We're ready to go, right? Well, we wanted to try to make it even easier. Archivists and librarians tend to fill out a lot of forms. It's something that's familiar. We created a form using Qualtrics because Penn State has a site license and we needed to do some math and logic that Google Forms and Microsoft Forms don't support. The form is basically an implementation of the rubric that calculates a score and outputs a recommended level of digital preservation commitment for the material being evaluated. Each criteria is presented as a dropdown. The dropdowns include language and point values from the rubric. The first section of the form collects some basic information about the objects being evaluated and who is filling out the form. If a disk size is entered, the form will also output an estimated annual cost of preservation storage, just preservation storage, not the labor or time involved to do the preservation. This is often an eye-opener, especially at level 2 and 3, where we start to replicate content into distributed digital preservation networks. One of the recommendations that came from piloting this process with selectors and curators was to add a justification field for each criterion. People wanted to be able to explain their choices, and this was an extremely useful recommendation, and we decided to keep a completed copy of this form on file with the collection to be used to inform decisions about the content in the future. Throughout, I mentioned some of the changes that were incorporated based on feedback. It was very helpful to have both a selector and a curator involved in the early stages of creating the guidelines and rubric. Their input was incorporated and made future collaboration smoother because I better understood their perspectives. After this initial back and forth, we expanded the pilot to try adding this process to the front end of 2 new digital collections, as well as incorporated it into some work we're doing to clean up 2 legacy digital collections. When we expanded the pilot, I scheduled one-on-one virtual meetings to review the guidelines with the evaluator, and we walked through the form together while they filled it out. I was pleasantly surprised that most collection managers didn't want everything to be a level 3. They understood the resource limitations and that we needed to be judicious. However, in one case, when we did end up at a level 3 for a very large digitized collection, I was able to discuss the implications with the curator and we re-examined the criteria, resulting in a shift to a level 2. The dollar change was significant. Changes to the process made at this point were less about the guidelines and rubric and more about the usability adjustments to the form. There may have been some initial hesitancy, but after an introduction and overview, selectors and curators quickly saw that this wasn't overly burdensome. That being said, if faced with having to make selections for multiple collections at once, there can be pushback. Reminding selectors and curators that the form is only one tool and not the only way levels can be assigned has helped ease this concern, as they simply review the criteria and decide on an appropriate level using their professional judgment. Presently, I'd say this activity has shifted from pilot to beta. It's still rather new to our library, and we're thinking about ways to introduce it to as many selectors and curators at Penn State. One anecdote to end on. One of the curators who piloted this process with a new digital collection was very reluctant to participate. He's someone who prefers the analog world and gets flustered by technology. I convinced him that this wasn't so much about the technology, but about the content and that he was the best person to make this decision. As we walked through the form together, he began to realize that this was something he could do, and he understood that this is a form of archival appraisal. As someone I had to chase down to do this, he ended up on the other end of the spectrum and said, if I can do it, anyone can do it. Thank you. Lauren?
Thanks, Nathan. Lauren Work, I'm going to start by spending a little bit of time on the context of how the work of iterative, curatorial, and digital preservation collaboration for selection has taken shape at the University of Virginia. Next slide, please. I hope this context proves useful for folks maybe just getting started with working on collaborations and selection, or maybe you're just trying to figure out what kind of digital preservation planning approach you're going to take. I was thinking about the title of this presentation a little bit last night, From Policy to Practice, and I really think my organizational context and digital preservation needs, like Kelsey touched on earlier, are almost the reverse. This is an organization that really needed to start with small practices to gain footholds toward organizational preservation planning policy, because that's what's really allowed collaborations and understanding, especially for selection and appraisal, to thrive and grow. So my context, I'm responsible for digital preservation for all digital materials at UVA Library, but in this presentation, I'll focus on my work with special collections and archives, because that's where this work needed to focus, and really that's where some of my most needed collaborators are. And the history of selection and appraisal responsibilities, like a lot of organizations, is pretty mixed. Some folks are really clear that this is meant to be part of their role in collections management, including for digital materials. Others may be less sure or are learning and working towards how this fits into their known workflows. Preservation is a distinct unit within the library, and I'm part of this unit. I started in 2016. And UVA currently has no digital archivist per se, but we do have a lot of awesome new archivists hired on who understand and desire to work with all materials as part of their work, along with some longtime processors who have really wanted to make this part of their work, but also really needed guidance. And this context is important, particularly because for a long while before I or any of the newer archivists were hired, digital materials, especially media, like a lot of places, were separated out from collections. And besides a grant-funded archivist years ago, nobody yet had the distinct responsibility of dealing with accessioning and selection and processing born digital materials. So this meant we had some work to do. People needed to understand their expected roles for digital materials. We had to build communication and buy-in for collaboration for those materials. We needed resourcing and strong administrative support for staff to be expected to work on digital materials in this way, not just the digital preservation librarian. And we needed to trust each other with our experience and our expertise. Next slide, please. So knowing this context and being aware when I started of some pretty strong administrative reluctance around policy, perhaps they knew enforcement would be difficult without establishing practice and trust, but most likely that authority would be needed to adhere to these policies. So instead, I worked initially to address some of the more immediate needs around preservation storage, creating a levels of preservation storage framework that would help curators and other selectors give their input for preservation storage levels grounded in their subject expertise related to collection characteristics, like unique research ability, rights management, subjects, mission, all those kinds of things. This also helped me get preservation levels planning and actions off the ground. And this practice served as an introduction to collection managers and selectors in special collections that their input was needed for preservation decisions. They were expected to put forth reasoning that centered their subject expertise as to why their collection or digital materials might need to be stored, say, in our most expensive storage tier. And this went well for a while, until after one collections meeting where they had to go through several collections, as Nathan alluded to earlier. And after having to do that and determine level selection, they politely informed me that they never wanted to go through the process in that way again. And fair enough. While the levels of preservation introduction allowed for preservation planning to begin, the process of selection for digital preservation needed more specific collection connections and collaboration with curators, as well as needing to be emphasized much earlier in the collection management cycle. And I'd started working with Nathan on our guidelines at this time, and I started testing some of the ways our work might fit into what I hope to eventually segue into something like collection streams for preservation planning. So I worked with our university archivist, who's responsible for selection of web archives, on what a practical curatorial guidance framework focused on both technical and content appraisal using the criteria that Nathan and I had worked on, what that might look like. I also introduced levels of preservation storage and selection responsibilities as part of the collections process for our digital collections group, which is a cross-departmental group. And I worked with archivists to form more pre-custodial approaches to selection for digital preservation by working on born digital donor and transfer checklists. Next slide, please. Building these practices, establishing trust with curators and archivists, and a better overall understanding of roles and expectations for digital content and special collections and archives led to my local introduction of Nathan and I's framework for specific curatorial feedback and adaptation over the last year or so. And this introduction was purposely paired with several additional ongoing collection initiatives that really helped kind of buttress the needs of selection along with other collection management. This included a revision of our collection strategy and a major overhaul, our continued digital preservation policy and planning, including preservation levels that builds on prior practice, collections impact statements that now include digital materials, donor agreement updates that now reflect digital material needs more accurately, and a year-long training and learning initiative for born digital workflows, including appraisal in special collections. And overall, so far, curators have responded very positively to what I've called locally a framework for collaborative selection. And we're continuing our iterative work for implementation this year. Next slide, please. So what is next for us? Really putting this into practice locally again. Some curators have expressed interest in a point scoring system like Nathan outlined, but I'm really feeling that we might be moving towards something more like Kelsey had described, where maybe we need a mix of both and we don't necessarily have a point scoring system, but we'll see. We have to iterate and see what works best for us. We'll also continue to need buy-in and expectations from our management for staff to work with and appraise digital materials. And we will continue our pragmatic, hands-on work of building our digital processing workflows with this in mind. Pre-custodial intervention and outreach to establish expectations around selection is also really high on my list, but I'm personally really looking forward to how this work on selection for digital preservation will allow my continued preservation planning work on things like collection streams to develop, moving us from a projects-based program to a more programmatic approach for digital preservation. And with that, I'll turn it over to Sarah.
Hi, everybody. I'm Sarah Dorpinghaus. I'm the Director of Digital Services at the University of Kentucky Libraries in their Special Collections Research Center, where I lead our digital preservation efforts. And today I'm going to talk about how UK Libraries has made selection for digital preservation a more collaborative process. Next slide, please. So at UK Libraries in our special collections, we encounter appraisal and selection decisions throughout the digital curation process. I do want to mention that Kina Hertzinger and Heather Fox, both of whom are at the University of Louisville, and I have presented specifically on microappraisal and digital curation workflows. So my comments today do reflect their theories as well. And you can check out our best practices exchange presentation slide at this link. Next slide, please. So at UK, the first time we see the selection happening is, of course, at the time of acquisition or donation of a born digital or hybrid collection, or during the selection process for selecting collections to be digitized. And this is mostly happening at the collection level or at this macro appraisal level. Yeah, next slide. So at this point, selection is based on the general subject matter and research value of the material, the size of the collection, and I mean both the digital footprint for the files as well as the storage space required for the physical media if we choose to keep it. And then of course, the format and technical requirements of the physical media and the files themselves. And due to these considerations, this level of macro appraisal requires communication and collaboration between the curators, the archivists, and the digital preservation specialists. Because like what Kelsey mentioned earlier, we are conducting both content and technical appraisal at the same time. Now, in some cases, we do just say yes to all the content at the time of donation, and we know that later that we're going to evaluate things at a more detailed or lower level of appraisal, which I consider the micro appraisal part of our workflows. Next slide, please. So this micro appraisal happens at different times. It can happen shortly after donation when we migrate the files to our servers. It can happen during processing when we're taking a closer look at the files for descriptive purposes. And appraisal can also happen at the point in time of access, especially with legacy collections. Because we've definitely run into that situation where a patron is looking at a collection in our research room and they happen to pull out a floppy disk out of a folder, when looking at a collection and they need to access those files. Next slide, please. So most of the same considerations at that high level or macro appraisal are taken into account during this micro appraisal work, but they just manifest differently in our practices and our workflows. So I'm going to briefly explore those. Next slide, please. We learned that we don't have the capacity to do a full detailed migration for all of our born digital content. So we adopted a tiered approach for migrating and preserving our born digital content. And this slide shows the levels of activities that we use for transfer, storage, documentation, and review. And I do want to point out that this is just kind of an abbreviated version for a visual here, so I apologize for the small font. And with this chart, we also use a decision tree to help determine which levels is most appropriate. And we can make this decision either at the collection level or at the physical media level. And I've got a link on this slide that sends you to this actual decision tree and gives you a better look at this chart here that's displaying. So you're welcome to look at it. Just keep in mind that it is truly a working document, so it's not perfectly polished. Now, I don't have time to dig into all the aspects and caveats of this decision tree or of, of this chart right here, but I do want to highlight a few important considerations. Next slide. So when we're doing this appraisal work, some of the questions that we ask are, what is the research value of the collection? Is there sensitive information? How were the files created and edited? Was it on the physical media that they're on right now? What's most efficient for us and for our workflows? What do we have capacity for? Is any of the physical media damaged? And lastly, is there useful metadata embedded in the files? And a quick review of these questions shows that we are generally making microappraisal decisions based on efficiency, research value, and the usefulness or the value of the outcome, right? Like what is produced by these preservation actions. And I just want to point out that these questions that I just outlined, again, require input from both curators and digital preservation specialists. One group cannot make a well-informed decision without the input on the other, based on their respective knowledge and skills. So in practice, when this happens, it really can look like either casual conversations, someone dropping by my office or sending a quick email, or we also, as needed, we'll meet formally and have a full fleshed out discussion about this. But in general, it's not just sort of a one and done conversation. We do tend to talk about it from time to time throughout sort of the whole workflow of the collection. Next slide, please. So I also really want to quickly talk about a more recent development at UK libraries, and that's the creation of a digital preservation policy and how this too has helped foster collaboration around digital preservation activities. And this is happening more at the full libraries level rather than within the special collections department. So after a couple stalled attempts of me trying to get a policy started on my own, I brought in our head of libraries IT and our digital humanities librarian to the conversation. I just want to quickly mention that our work creating this policy was heavily informed by the work of Dan Noonan and his colleagues at The Ohio State University. And you can read more about that at this article linked here. Next slide. So the committee that we put together consisted of a variety of folks from across the libraries. There's the head of IT, myself, we had catalogers, we had subject specialists, and both faculty and staff were represented on this committee. And one of the things that we looked at closely was what categories of content should be preserved to what level. And after seeing Nathan's presentation, I definitely want to look more at Penn State University's rubric to consider in our work moving forward. But each of us came to this committee with our specific interests directly related to our roles and responsibilities. But it was so helpful to take a step back and look at the preservation needs from across the library system in a holistic way. And the collaboration didn't stop at the members of this committee. We gathered input through surveys and drop-in sessions, and we shared drafts of the policy with key internal stakeholders and then later the entire library system. And it was really interesting to see who was interested in learning more about digital preservation. I mean, there's the obvious folks like those special collections who work with digital collections, also our government documents librarian, our records manager. But there were also folks who joined the conversation, but were not necessarily aligned with digital preservation work according to their position titles or their responsibilities, but they just simply had a professional curiosity and they wanted to, develop some knowledge in that area, which is really exciting. So the good news is the policy was approved and we are going to create a digital preservation interest group that is open to everybody in the libraries to keep the conversation rolling. And we're going to focus on educating colleagues, adopting consistent digital preservation workflows and practices across the library system, and then hopefully complete some regular self-evaluation. So I just wanted to share this example of how developing a formal digital preservation policy can and should be a collaborative process, which ultimately increases buy-in for this work. Next slide. So you're welcome to contact me if you have any questions. And now I'm going to hand it off to Elena.
Thank you, Sarah. So hello, everyone. Once again, my name is Elena Colón-Marrero, and while I am currently the archivist for digital curation at the Bentley Historical Library, I will be speaking about my time as a digital archivist at the Computer History Museum. Next slide, please. So first, I want to start off with a little bit of context regarding how normal appraisal practices work at the museum. So at CHM, the process is generally called donation review, and our set of curators and various archivists and museum registrars meet bi-weekly to discuss donation offers. And donation offers come from a variety of places. A lot of them come from an online web form that potential donors can fill out to tell us what they have and why they think it might be of interest to us. We also have some collections that come in via curator cultivation. And there's even the maybe not so preferred method that everyone has of just the physical drop-off at the museum or one of our buildings. So you may be wondering kind of at this point, how does appraisal of born digital objects come into play in this kind of bi-weekly review process? And to that, I honestly say, I wonder how to. Next slide. And so prior to maybe 2018, roughly, it was up to the archivist to intercept potential digital donations at these donation review meetings and bring up any concerns or limitations that we might have at these meetings. To avoid some of this intercepting work, the senior digital archivist at the time, Andrew Berger, with the help of our museum registrar, Aurora Tucker, and myself, created a digital materials questionnaire. What you see on the screen is just a screenshot of page 2 of that questionnaire. And this questionnaire is actually supplemental to another one that is a general donor questionnaire. And it is a 2-page fillable PDF with questions related to donation size, file organization structures, programs we may need, and if we should be aware of any confidential information that are on these files. And so these questions may be more than what other institutions or even museums may need for their collections, but we do frequently get software source code and other software related materials that frankly we can't open or access in a meaningful way. So this questionnaire becomes one of the few ways that we actually know what those files are. And in theory, we would like the curators to kind of work with donors to complete this questionnaire before the review process and include it with their potential donation review forms that we also ask our curators to complete. But in practice, this is very rarely done. Our current registrar is still working with our curators to just get a potential donation review form completed for the donations. And so asking for supplementary materials can be really difficult when we need the first material to be completed, and that is kind of the main priority. So usually this form is sent to donors after donation has been accepted, and they are directed to me if they have any questions in completing this form. And let's just say that there are always questions when completing this form. Next slide. So getting this form after donation has been accepted has proved to be extremely problematic, especially since a donation that is not curator cultivated does not have a lot of information relating to the digital materials shared with us ahead of time. And there have been instances where what a donor says they have is kind of 1, not what they actually have or are providing to us, and 2, the size of the files exceed what we can normally take in. The museum currently does not have a singular system for accepting large digital donations. We really work on a case-by-case basis to get those materials. And to date, we actually don't get a lot of born digital donations, and most digital donations that we do get are a handful of documents that at most can truly be attached to an email, and that's how they're sent to us. In rare instances where files can't be attached to an email, I've had to find ways around our current limitations to accept those files and accession them into our collection. Additionally, we are also either currently at capacity or close to capacity on our staging servers and on our digital repository. And I frequently stress during donation review meetings how vital it is to have the information in that digital materials questionnaire completed before we accept a donation so that we can talk through what is needed to properly care for the born digital materials being given to us. And these talks generally have varying success depending on the curator, the day, is it raining outside, et cetera, et cetera. But I have always been supported by our other archivists, registrars, and collections managers during these conversations. Next slide. So one of the biggest game changers that has influenced our appraisal process for born digital materials especially is development of a collections development plan, or at the museum, like we call it, a collecting plan. So prior to the development of this collections plan, there really was no document. Each curator was in charge of deciding what to take based on their area of expertise. There was some consideration for what we already had in our collection in the space that we had, but it meant that in terms of digital objects for me and other archivists, we really didn't have teeth to say, no, we can't accept that, and this is why. The collecting plan itself was started in late 2018 and has been mostly finalized in late 2020. And during this time, each curator was paired with the collection staff member to assess an area of our collection, including gathering information about what we currently have, what we don't have, how much space is being used and how much space is free, what our resources are like, and most importantly, to establish what we aren't going to collect. For born digital objects, this meant that we would err on the side of caution when presented with cloud-based software, mobile applications, and websites. And I hesitate to say won't collect, especially for born digital materials, even though saying won't collect would be my personal preference, because there are still internal debates regarding the collection of websites specifically. But with the growing shift in museum priorities to building the museum's first ever digital asset management system and migrating our current collections management system to a new system, complicated digital donations such as websites really wouldn't have the proper attention that we could give to them and the attention that it deserves to be properly preserved. And some curators understand this limitation and the lack of resources for handling born digital materials, but not all of them do. And so my goal specifically has been to focus on those curators that do understand what our current limitations are in hopes that they can influence the other curators in decision-making processes. Next slide. So where is the museum now? And by now, I really mean, where was the museum at when I finally kind of left? So we still have the form in place that is currently being filled out by donors. And there is hope to incorporate the digital asset management system into our general workflows for incoming donations, and especially digital donations. Our hope is to create a deposit folder for donors to put their materials in. And once those materials have been added, it would trigger a workflow process for both the registrar and the digital archivist to kind of begin their own separate work. But for now, our process generally remains the same. However, there's just no one actively processing donated born digital materials until either a new digital archivist is hired or until the DAM and CMS migrations are complete. And with that, I would like to thank you for your time today, and I will pass it on to Nathan to conclude our presentation.
We wanted to leave you with some takeaways that we hope will help your organization move forward with selection and appraisal for digital preservation. Appraisal can occur anywhere, anytime. It's often collaborative, but collaboration can take time and it can be hard to change old ways. Iterate as you need to and advocate for the necessary staffing and resources. Thank you for participating in our session today. There's already been some questions in the chat, but please feel free to contact us if you have any questions after today. Thank you very much.